Welcome everyone to Before You Hit Submit, our professional development webinar on how asking a grant writer. So asking a grant writer for tips on making the best application you can, and what to do before you submit that application to us, the Mississippi Arts Commission. Today we have Bob Arnold on. He was here last year and is back now by popular demand. Bob is the Director of Grantsmanship Services for Community Works Consulting, a Los Angeles-based nonprofit consulting firm. And before joining CWC in 2022, he served as the Associate Director of Development for the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art, where he was responsible for the museum's entire grants portfolio, including more than 20 annual grants and several multi-million-dollar capital grants. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Arnold, who's going to talk to us today about some tips for grant writing.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Thanks to you and Leslie for the invitation to come back this year. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be talking to you today, and I hope that I can provide some good thoughts, food for thought, and helpful information and tips and tricks as you finish up your proposals to the Mississippi Arts Commission. So that was a really nice overview that Lauren gave of who I am. This is the website for the firm that I am working with if you are interested in learning more about us. I think you heard there, I spent most of my career in Memphis. So because of that, I'm not purporting to be an expert on the Mississippi Arts Commission or MAC grants, although I have kind of explored what's involved with them. But just so you know, today is more about kind of polishing up your proposal before you hit submit. So today we're not going to get into the specifics of the different programs, the grant programs that MAC offers. We're not going to talk about all the different guidelines that are readily available. Hopefully you are familiar with that stuff already. Hopefully you have already started your proposal, and this will just give you some things to think about as you wrap it up and finalize it over the next week or week and a half. So I'd like to start with a couple of quick survey questions that Lauren has queued up for me in the Zoom survey function. The first one being, what are you applying for? Which grant are you applying for? And there's a drop down you will see there where you can select any of these options: operating project, fellowship, these individual grants, so fellowship, project, or folk art apprenticeship. And then the next question, which you'll see there as well, where in the application process for 2024, fiscal 2025 are you? And this is there's no reason to lie to me. I can't see who's answering what way. So please be honest, and this will let us know how much we need to focus on the beginning of your grant proposal versus the end. So I will go ahead and say I do have some tips and tricks toward the end of this presentation for those who are just starting, some things to help you not to mitigate the panic, but at least manage the panic if you're just getting started on your proposal. So if you'll take a second and answer those two questions, we'll know more about who is in the room with us today. I'm going to go ahead and move on. But Lauren, when it looks like the answers have pretty well come in, if you'll just give me a heads up, and we can talk about how people answered those. Oh, hey, look, there's the poll results. Cool. Okay. So most of you looking at organization grants, which is great. Most of you in the middle, which is excellent. Those of you that 14% just starting, we're going to try to ease your nerves a little bit. That 14% who are ready to submit, this is going to be especially good for you because it'll give you those last few things to think about and ease your mind before you submit. Also, kudos to you for working in advance. So great, thank you all. That's really helpful to know. Okay, so before you hit submit, some things to think about as you are reviewing your grant proposal to the Mississippi Arts Commission. First of all, here is my thesis statement today. The overarching goal of all of these revisions that we will be talking about will be to make it easy for your reader, okay? Make it easy for your reader. So everything that we're talking about really kind of comes back to this. It may be hard for you to believe, having just written a grant and knowing that the grant writing experience can sometimes be an unpleasant experience. Hopefully not for you, but sometimes it can. Some people don't care for it. It may surprise you to hear that reading a grant really should be a pleasant experience for your reader. Reading your proposal really should get the reader excited and fired up about the work, the great work that you are doing across the state. So as you review your proposal and you think about how to polish it up and tweak it before you hit submit, think about making it easy for your reader and really think about how to tell the most exciting kind of story that you can, how to capture this great work that you are doing. Remember that your submission to the Mississippi Arts Commission will be reviewed by a panel of volunteers. Some of those volunteers may be experts in your subject area, in your artistic discipline. Some of them may not. Some of them may be people from the arts community. Some of them may not. Some of them may be located in Mississippi. Some of them may not. So I was fortunate enough to be asked to review on a panel for MAC last year. So I fit some of those criteria, but not all. So be aware that your readers may not be experts. They may, in your artistic discipline, they may not even be from the arts community, and they may not be located in Mississippi. So you want to make sure, even in that case, they can understand and get excited by your proposal. So again, keep coming back to this thought. We're going to make it easy for your reader. As we go, by the way, if you have specific questions, like Lauren said, if you'll pop them into the chat, she is going to help me navigate those, respond to those. So we may pause and answer some as we go, or certainly we will have time at the end for your questions and your comments and any specific advice that I can give you, or if you have specific questions about the proposals, the MAC team is on today too and should be able to help. Okay, my first specific bit of advice before you hit submit is to revisit the grant guidelines. You are very fortunate in the case of these specific Mississippi Arts Commission proposals because the guidelines are super, super clear. So ideally, you read the guidelines for your specific proposal before you started working on it. Hopefully you've referenced them as you have been working on it. But now that you are done drafting, or as you get done drafting, go read them again. Reread the full guidelines for the category in which you are applying. Having written the proposal, right, having developed it over a course of time, you're going to now be familiar with all the different criteria that they are talking about, all the different sections. And this is just a great reminder to see if anything pings that you had forgotten to address, right? You're going to be able to point that out now because you're so familiar with your proposal. So again, the MAC guidelines are so clear, they're detailed. Just take a minute before you hit submit and reread them top to bottom and make sure you are addressing them. You're also very lucky in that MAC provides review criteria, okay? Not every funder is going to tell you, here's what we're looking for, but they do very specifically. So on the guidelines page for each grant, you have a list of review criteria. You have a list of things that your reader is tasked with looking for in your grant proposal. So make sure you have addressed each of those things. Make sure that you are mirroring the language of those things. So in other words, I noted in one of the grants, one of the review criteria falls under the category of public participation and access. Okay, not only do you want to make sure that your reviewer sees that information in your proposal, you want to make sure that they know that's exactly what you were talking about. So you might have a subheading that literally says public participation and access. Or you might say, our organization engages in public participation and access by blank, okay? use that specific language when you can. Mirror the language of those review criteria so that your reviewer, when they're reading, they've got to check that box, right? Make it easy for them to connect those dots and check that box. Yes, this was addressed. Make sure you're addressing all the review criteria. If there's anything that you're, again, if you're rereading these criteria, there's anything you think, well, we didn't really address that. We didn't really address that strongly. Now is a great time to go back and tweak and strengthen that part of your proposal. I suggested mirroring the language from the review criteria. When it makes sense, why not mirror the order too, right? Why not fill in almost like a template? Make sure that your proposal flows in that same order as those review criteria. Again, this one's a little more like if it makes sense to do it that way. You might be telling your story in a different order. But again, make it easy for your reader who has this template of review criteria. Make it easy for them to check off each box, assign you those points, and make sure you have done everything that they want you to do. Remember, by the way, that your reviewers are comparing your application not just to those review criteria, but to a rubric associated with them. So they're going to assign you points based on how well you answer. So make sure you're answering clearly, make sure they know which criteria you are responding to, and then do everything you can to maximize those points. Remember that this is a competitive proposal. You are competing for these dollars, right? So it's not enough just to meet the criteria. You've got to excel. You've got to exceed the criteria wherever you can. It's not enough to say, well, yes, we do public participation and access. You've got to really show a strong case that you don't just do it, you do it well, okay? So I said before, these reviewers are going to be checking off boxes. That's really not true. They're going to be assigning you a point value based on your responses. So make sure as you are reviewing these guidelines on this review criteria, as you're going back over this, make sure that you are squeezing out every possible point that you can, because it may come down to it may come down to a single point. That line gets drawn somewhere. Everyone above it is funded. Everyone below it is not or is reduced or whatever. Make sure you are doing everything you can to be above that line. Okay, that's revisiting the guidelines. That's looking at the material that the Mississippi Arts Commission provides. My next suggestion to you will be to reread your own grant narrative with all of that in mind that you just revisited from the guidelines. It's good to approach it fresh. If you can, you've got now about a week and a half until the deadline. So if you can take a night off from it, that's great. Come back to it fresh in the morning. And act as much as you can as though you are reading it for the first time. That fresh set of eyes, even if it's the same set of eyes, but that freshness will help you identify any weak points, any dots that you have failed to connect, anything that you have left out entirely, and any review criteria that you have not fully responded to. I always suggest asking someone else to read it too. Some of you are with large organizations. Some of you may be individual artists. Some of you may be running an organization, solo. You may be executive director and all of everything else. Even in that case, if you can find someone, a board member, a colleague in a different organization, someone you trust to read your proposal, that will always help. That will always give some perspective. Notice that I say ask someone else to read it too, right? To, not instead of. Rereading, finalizing is always your responsibility. It's always up to you to make sure this is a complete and compelling proposal. But the benefit of getting an outside person to read this, even if it's an outside person within your own organization, is that, as I said before, you don't know who your panelists are going to be. You don't know what their background is going to be. So anyone that you hand this proposal to should theoretically be able to read it, should be able to follow it and understand it, and should be moved by it, right? Should be compelled by it and excited about it and feel like they want to do something to help your organization. So getting someone else to read it for you is a great way to do that. I always suggest when you can to read, when you're rereading this finalized version of your narrative, read it in a printer-friendly version. Why? Well, because sometimes these portals look a little different on the back end than they do on the front end. They look a little different when the reader sees them than when you're entering text. And the printer-friendly version is usually the closest you're going to get to that version that the reader sees. In the Mac portal, there is a function that is called application packet. That is the printer-friendly version that puts everything into a PDF that you have entered and shows it back to you. So I highly recommend reading it that way, if only to get out of the same input format that you've been looking at. Again, it will help you revisit this with fresh eyes. But also because sometimes things get funky when you put them into a portal and then you output it on the other side. So as you reread this printer-friendly version, I recommend watching for odd interpretations of characters. This is not a theater joke, all you theater artists. What I mean is sometimes you will put in a bullet point and it will show up in some weird scrambled HTML code. It doesn't look like a bullet, it looks like an ampersand and some letters. Sometimes you will put in a dash and it just disappears. Sometimes you think you've put in a paragraph break and you have not. So anything like that, bullets, quotation marks, especially italics, those have a tendency to disappear. Reread and make sure all that stuff is coming through. Now you're lucky here in that the Mac portal has some of these formatting tools built in. I believe there is a bold function, an italic function, things like that. So you're not trying to necessarily port that over from, say you've written this document in Word and you're trying to copy and paste it. There is a function within the Mac portal that will allow you to add some of this formatting. So as you read, just make sure it's there. If it's not there, go back to your input in the portal, to your proposal in the portal, and add your formatting. More thoughts about rereading. As you read this final version, I suggest you read for clarity, consistency, readability, and confidence. So here's what I mean. For clarity, your proposal really should tell a clear and comprehensible story. It is telling the story of either your organization in this coming year, in the past year, or your program in this coming year or the past year, your work as an artist in this coming year or the past year. Make sure that you are telling the full comprehensive story of what you're doing, of course, within the space limits that you have. That may mean trimming out some stuff where you really get into the weeds. That may mean really focusing on what we're doing now versus what we did during COVID. Whatever keeps things clear and to the purpose, whatever makes it clear, makes it easy for your reader, right? I want you to focus on that. Also, as much as you can within the structure of the application, I would suggest considering the flow of the application. Doesn't always make sense to talk about the deep details of a program and then talk about who your organization is and then talk about the problem that you were trying to address, right? If you can set things up in a logical way, in a logical flow for your reader, it's going to make it easier for them to follow your argument and to understand your story. So that's clarity. Consistency. What do I mean by consistency? Sometimes multiple people work on these things, and it's always good in a final pass to try to smooth that out and get rid of those, the different styles that all come together that can feel a little patchwork, that can feel a little bumpy at times. Having said that, even sometimes if you're working on this by yourself, it's worth rereading for consistency. Think about things like verb tenses, the way that you frame your sentences, the way that the verbs are conjugated, the voice that you use. Is this a formal kind of application? Is it more informal? Do all the sections have the same voice? Use of first person versus third person. Do you always say our organization, this and this and this, our executive director, this and this, or do you say we, our goal is to do this, our mission? Either is okay, either can be create a compelling proposal, but I would stick with, one or the other throughout the application, at least be consistent about it. So, and then finally, acronyms and terms that are specific to your field. And I'll talk more about jargon here in just a second. But say you throw in an acronym, make sure you have defined it. If we used to use MBMA for the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art. I don't want to use MBMA before I say Memphis Brooks Museum of Art, parentheses, MBMA. And then possibly even throughout the proposal now and then do that again, right? Just to refresh people, especially if you're throwing multiple acronyms out at them. So that's consistency. Readability. Readability. This goes back again to making things easy and pleasant for your reader. And here is where I will mention jargon. So if you are in some kind of really deep, say, assessment evaluation work, and you have these specific terms or these activities that you use to assess, and this may not be something that's familiar to a general audience. So make sure you define them. Make sure you tell us what you're talking about before you dive deep into it. Again, we're trying to make this easy for your reader, and you don't know who your reader is going to be. So make sure you are defining your acronyms, make sure you are defining your terms and your industry jargon before you launch right into it. Yeah. Also, for readability, think about providing your reader with some white space on the page, with some paragraph breaks. The eye gets tired when it is reading, and the eye gets especially tired when it's reading a huge unbroken block of text. So paragraph breaks, white space, like a space between them, not just a break and an indentation, but a blank space between them, gives the eye a moment to rest. And I can tell you, as someone who has written and read countless grant proposals, when I open up a proposal to review and I see an unbroken block of text, my first reaction is always, I can't help it. It's just, oh. And that is not the reaction that you want your reader to have, right? You want them to be excited. You want them to be energized. So think about giving them space to breathe. Think about giving them white space within the blocks, when you're outputting this as a printer-friendly version, there should be some space in there. The tendency is to want to just cram everything in, right? Fill every little inch, every little bit to the margins. And that is just exhausting for your reader, and it sets a sour tone. By the way, the Mississippi Arts Commission is counting characters in your text. They're not counting words or spaces. I mean, they're counting spaces as one character. So a paragraph break takes the same amount of space as a space, right? So there is no reason, there's no, character limit reason not to have white space and paragraph breaks. It's going to cost you about the same amount of characters, and it's worth it. Finally, confidence. What do I mean by confidence? I read a lot of grant proposals that say, with this money, we could do this. We would be able to do this. And that kind of conditional language, whether they intend it to or not, can plant a seed of doubt in your reader's mind. It can make them go, oh, this is iffy. This is all kind of contingent. We will do this. With this funding, we will, etc. We will carry this out. Our goals are this. We will reach these goals by doing this. So as you go back and reread your proposal, be firm, be confident, and don't give them any reason to think that this kind of the stuff that you are planning, that you are going to do, that's in your strategic plan, right? That's in your program plan. Don't give them any reason to think that that stuff might not happen. This will happen. Speak with confidence. And if you're genuinely not confident about the programs that you are proposing, why are you proposing them? Okay. So now you have reread the guidelines. You have reread the narrative with all this stuff in mind. You've reread that printer-friendly version with all this different stuff in mind. The next thing to do is to check your budget figures. Do they add up? Seems like a goofy question, but you would be surprised. Budget figures at least have to add up. Now you're fortunate here because the Mac portal will auto-calculate the totals of these figures, but still, double check all of your budget figures. Not only do they match, do they add up correctly, but do they match your official program budget? Do they match your official organization budget? All of your numbers should tie together across all of your documentation. And if not, if there's some reason why they don't, that should be explained. I can tell you that this is actually the last point on this slide, but I can tell you that I have sat on panels with people who are CPAs and finance people, and they don't even, the first thing they do, they skip right past the narrative and they start going through the budget and making sure everything adds up. Are your grant funds matched? I believe MAC requires generally a 1-to-1 grant match. So if you're requesting $50,000 in support, then you have to show that you're bringing in at least $50,000 in other support to match it. Are your budget funds consistent with your narrative? If say you're proposing general operating support and 80% of your proposal is talking about this outreach program, and the outreach program is about 10% of your budget, that's really not consistent, right? Why are you spending so much time on this thing that is really a minor part of your operations, at least budgetarily? So make sure those things are all kind of proportionate to each other. Make sure they feel like they match. Do they tell a complete story? This is more applicable to your program grants and your individual artist grants. But we as nonprofits have a tendency to say, look, this program just costs $5,000. And if you give us $5,000, it's done. Everything else is done. Well, that's not true. The program does not cost $5,000 because you, the organization, are bringing a lot of stuff to the table. You are bringing possibly your staff, your venue. You could be bringing materials that are, even if they're from a previous program, you're putting marketing into this program. You are doing evaluation. Make sure all of that stuff is accounted for in your budget. It's always better. I always really push nonprofits to tell that full story. For example, when I worked at the Brooks, we had an auditorium that the public could rent the auditorium for $500 a day. If we needed to use that auditorium for a program, and I was building a program budget and the program happened inside the auditorium, the value of that auditorium for that day is $500, and that goes in the budget. And we can show it being offset with in-kind support from ourselves, but that is $500 that we cannot get from the public because of this program. That's the value. So things like that, think through the full value of this program. I can tell you that your savvy reviewers will notice if things are missing. If you say, look, all we need are materials, they're immediately going to think, well, what about staff? If you have no staff, working on this program, it's not in your best interest to minimize your own contribution to this program or to any of the work that you are doing. I believe there is a space within the MAC application to talk about in-kind support. So there may be some things that you can't quantify, but maybe we do this work with some paint that has been donated, or we get volunteers to do this or that. There is space to discuss that stuff. And I believe maybe Lauren can talk about how that's handled specifically within these proposals. But as long as it's represented there, that's my advice to you. Just make sure it's represented so that you're telling this full, complete story of your program and your operations. Okay. We've checked our budget. We've checked our narrative. We checked the guidelines again. Finally, we're going to check all of the attachments that are required for our grant proposal. Attachments often come to you, if you're working in an organization, they might come to you from the finance office or from the program folks, but it's still your responsibility to make sure that they are responding to the request within the grant criteria, to make sure that they're giving the reviewers what they need. So check to make sure, are all of your attachments in the requested file format? Sometimes people want to see a budget that is an Excel file or a spreadsheet. Sometimes they want to see it as a PDF. Sometimes it's either, and that's okay. Either is okay. But which, are you responding to the criteria? You're responding to the guidelines by submitting the type of file they want to see. Are the pages oriented correctly? I've been noticing recently, it looks like Adobe has started to restrict the ability to just flip pages, like reorient pages to their paid model, which is ridiculous, but that's a whole other soapbox. So if at all possible, don't make your reviewer do that. Your reviewer may not have the paid Adobe model, right? Make sure if you have got you're putting out a PDF, it shows up nicely on the screen. It is easy to read. It's in order. Similarly, if you're submitting something like a budget, and your budget is a spreadsheet and it has 35 tabs across the bottom that break down every little last thing, Is that really what they're asking for? Make sure. I'd be surprised if any reviewer wants that level of detail, and they're not going to appreciate you trying to beat them into submission with 35 different tabs on your spreadsheet. Make sure your files aren't password protected. Sometimes they come to you from the finance office with a password on them. If you have the ability to take that off, please do. If you don't, maybe figure out a way around it, or make triply sure that the reviewer or the reader can see them. Maybe even put the password in the file name or something like that. Are all of your attachments within the size limit? The system will probably kick them back if they're not. And if they're not, then make sure to size them down. But either way, just make sure you are abiding by what is being asked of you. And then generally, do they meet all the criteria? So for example, with the Mississippi Arts Commission, they ask you for a board list. Great, you think I have one of those. Let me just upload that, plug it in, and I'm done. But hold on, the Mississippi Arts Commission asks for a board list that contains demographic information about your board. So does that standard list that you uploaded contain that? Make sure. Okay. Once you have checked all of these things, you are at the threshold of submitting your application. So just a couple of quick tips for you before you finally hit submit at the tail end of this process. First of all, I always suggest that people step away for at least 10 minutes. Go for a walk, go say hi to a colleague, go change out a load of laundry, whatever works for you. But step away from your desk, step away from your work. That gives your brain a chance to go, whoa, hold on, I forgot to do this. I meant to do this. I didn't update those figures. I didn't change out this, I didn't take off the board member who rolled off. If you are barreling toward the deadline, you don't have time to think about that kind of stuff. You don't have time for your subconscious to lob that back into your brain, and you're going to miss it. If you have planned ahead, if you are one of those wonderful 14% who are finalizing your submission, then you have time, you have more than 10 minutes, you have overnight, sleep on it, come back and just do a quick review of everything one more time in the morning. I'm not saying reread everything from scratch. I'm just saying give yourself a little bit of space to think about any of those last things that might come up, and to give everything one last scan before you submit. No matter what you do, plan to submit well ahead of the deadline. If you miss something, the portal is going to tell you, hey, you didn't actually attach that. You thought you did, but you didn't. It's possible too, by the way, that the system can get overwhelmed and crash. I'm not speaking to the Mac system specifically. I don't know it, but the federal government system has crashed before because so many people were submitting their proposals at the 11th hour, at the 11th hour and 59th minute, that the system got overloaded and crashed. So separate yourself out from the crowd, make sure you are submitting well ahead of the deadline. I would say the day before, if at all possible. But if not possible, then at least 2 or 3 hours before the deadline is really ideal. A couple of quick thoughts about working in advance, and then a couple of quick thoughts about what to do if you haven't worked in advance. First of all, why work in advance? Why not just crank this thing out in a day or two? Well, I'm going to quote our very own Mississippi Arts Commission, who on their website says, organizations that give sufficient time and support to planning and grant writing benefit from clarified goals, more tangible objectives, clearer plans, better evaluation plans, improved record keeping, and better financial management. So this is not only a matter of your grant proposal and how you're portraying yourself. The process of grant writing is also a process of understanding your own organization, writing out the details of your program, finding problems, finding things that don't make sense, filling in gaps. So the more advanced work you can do, the more thought you can put into this process. It's not just going to pay off in your proposal and hopefully in your funding, it's going to pay off in your organization as well. If you're just starting, it happens. Okay, I know it happens. But if you are just now starting with a deadline of March 1st, a couple of points that I hope will help ease the next week and a half for you. First of all, you can see the previous slide for your proper shaming, right? From the Mississippi Arts Commission. You should have started earlier at this point. Okay, we'll stipulate that. Also know that it could be worse. You do have till the end of next week, I believe, to submit these proposals. The Mississippi Arts Commission submissions have modest character limits. This is not going to be a 100-page federal proposal. So, you may have some late nights, but you're not going to have all-nighters between now and then, I don't think. So could be worse. Be ready to update text from your previous proposals. It is absolutely okay to reuse text that is still applicable to your organization. And this is if you're rewriting a proposal for the same organization for the same program that you did last year or the year before. Reusing that sort of text is totally fine. It was true then. If it's true now, then it should be totally fine. But always make sure you are rereading it and updating it as necessary. You don't have to change it just to change it, but you're going to find that there are outdated things in there. So you need to make sure as you're doing this mad dash of copying and pasting that you are going through and updating things. And then all the stuff that we talked about before, rereading for clarity and consistency and all that stuff, this goes double for those of you who are doing this on the quick. As you're working quickly, I recommend that you maintain focus in your narrative. Panic can just lead to throwing everything against the wall, right? It can lead to word vomit. And you really want to avoid that because, again, we are trying to make things easy for your reader. So instead, focus on telling a clear and compelling story, making your grant readable, et cetera, et cetera. If you're in a panic, this is not the time to just throw everything against the wall and hope it sticks. Get help from your colleagues, especially if you're at a larger organization and you're under the gun. Hopefully you have someone who can help you, maybe write some other sections, maybe review some stuff while you're working on, they review part A while you're working on part B and all that kind of thing. If at all possible, in the week and a half that you have, don't try to do it alone. And then, of course, plan to start earlier next year. Hopefully you have learned your lesson and you don't like this feeling in the pit of your stomach. And now, hey, next year, we're going to get an early start on this. Finally, no matter where you are in the process now, when you are done, submit and take at least a moment to celebrate. Grant writing is a skill. It is a task. It is challenging. You want it to be great. You want it to be just as great as all of your other organizational operations. So before you move on to the next thing that is looming, the next thing that is the next fire to go put out, make sure you take at least a moment, however you like to do it, and celebrate a job well done. Okay. Those are my recommendations before you hit submit. I hope I have not frightened you. I hope that all is all helpful for you, and I would love to take questions and talk about any specifics that you want to talk about.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was excellent, and you brought up so many good points. There was a question in the chat that is maybe more specific to a grants question, so I can answer it, and then you can elaborate if you want. So Nicole asked, in the project budget sample, where do you place the value of a rental space where your project happens if the space is already in possession of your company? And this would be an in-kind match. And so that would be in the in-kind section. And I think, as Bob mentioned, you definitely want to emphasize every aspect of input that you're putting into your project. So you would want to make sure to mention that the value of that in-kind space. But our project grants do require a one-to-one cash match, so you would just need to show that match elsewhere. Did you want to elaborate any on the value of showing what in-kind inputs are part of that application, Bob?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Lauren, for addressing that there is a space. I thought I remembered that, but there is specifically a space within MAC to talk about in-kind, which is anything that is non-cash, right? So this is anything that is donated. It's also volunteer hours. So here's what I'm going to drop in the chat. There is an organization called Independent Sector that actually assigns a value to a volunteer hour. And they do this generally nationally. They do it all over. They do it state by state. So I'm doing this quickly. I haven't looked it up for Mississippi specifically, but I'm going to put this in the chat for your reference. So this is a way to say, it's a objective third-party way to say, look, we had 100 volunteers who each gave 5 hours. That 500 hours of volunteer time according to independent sector, would have cost us X if we'd had to go out and hire for it or pay somebody to do it. So all of that kind of stuff it shows buy-in. It shows that you are not just depending on the funder to do the work. You're not. You all are doing the work. You are doing this much and you need help to finish it off, right? And that's the ideal scenario. So make sure you are not selling yourself short. That is a soapbox for me.
That's great. I have some more questions for Bob, but I want to make sure if anyone else has a question, you're welcome to raise your hand or unmute yourself at this time and ask your question if you have a question for Bob or for Arts Commission staff. Bob, I wanted to ask you, you touched on this a little bit. Oh, we have a question from Mary Frances Massey that I'll make. In the narrative part, it says a character limit of 3,000. How important is it to meet that limit? Is it okay to get by with less, say 1,400 characters used? I'm so glad you asked that because that was one of the questions I was going to ask you too. Do you need to use the full space if you feel like you can fully answer the question in less? How does that look to a panelist?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And we have panelists here, so they may tell you something different. Here is what I would say to that. No, you do not have to fill the full space. However, remember that you are competing for this proposal. So if you have 3,000 characters and you give us 500, you're almost certainly not going to be competitive with someone else who is providing more information and is creating a stronger case for support. So if, once you're getting down into some of the weeds of these different questions, if that really is all that you have to say about it, I think that's totally fine. I don't ever recommend padding the narrative just for the sake of padding it. But I do recommend thinking about how it comes across if you have a already pretty small amount of text or a space to work with, and you're not even using that. How does that position you competitively?
That's great. I saw that Tony Davenport asked a question that I can answer quickly. If an artist is on the teaching or regular artist roster, would they still be eligible to apply for the fellowship? And yes, definitely. Our artist roster is a non-monetary roster of recommendations that, of artists that have been vetted by a panel of experts and are available for hire to organizations. However, they are definitely encouraged to apply for the fellowship as well, as long as you are a Mississippi resident. And I see another question from LL, project grant specific. Are photos of previous successful events hosted by an organization acceptable as work samples for proof of artistic excellence? I would say yes, definitely. And maybe Leslie, if you want to chime in, and if you want to add anything to that, Bob, too. You agree, Leslie? Okay. Yeah, I would just say yes. That's a great example of a work sample photo. Do you like seeing photos of previous successful events? Do you recommend that, Bob?
Yes, but not only. I always feel like photos are, sometimes you need that to really understand the scope. So for example, if you are, if you're a performing arts organization, sometimes the quality of the work really comes through best in a photograph, right? It really helps. If you're doing a public event and you've got pictures of, a bunch of kids creating art and they're looking happy and smiling, all that kind of stuff, it's great. It's great. However, I wouldn't do it instead of a narrative. I wouldn't lean on that to make your case, because that kind of stuff is more heartstrings, right? It's more emotional, and that absolutely has a place in grant writing. But it tends to have more of a place in foundation grants. It tends to have more of a place, if you're talking to a family foundation or someone who already loves you, pulling those heartstrings is exactly what they want. If you're talking about a state agency that reports to a federal agency, that kind of stuff is great, but it's not enough by itself.
Thank you for adding that. That's great to hear. And I'm just going to comment on something that Mary Frances says, because COVID maybe put a dent in our work for this application round. And that was something I was going to ask you, Bob, which is something we often talk to applicants about, is adding context to your applications and transparency about challenges that your community might face, or, you know, challenges that you're working to improve or address in your organization, while still kind of speaking with that confidence that you recommended that comes through in your application. So how do you suggest, if, you know, if folks maybe they don't have the board diversity where they want it to be, or maybe they're working towards accessibility, adding accessibility into their programs, but they're not quite where they want to be yet. Do you recommend that they address any of those concerns, or kind of like preemptively think about what panelists might notice as missing in their application? How do you suggest people address that?
Absolutely. That's such a great question and such a tricky thing when you're sitting down to write. What I would say, Lauren, is that it's always good to remember, gang, that your reviewers are humans too. They may not always feel that way to you, right? There's this faceless group that is allocating dollars, but they are humans too. I've never met a funder who didn't understand that you're going to run into challenges. They expect that, right? So you're not here to raise questions that, raise problems, raise red flags that don't need to be raised. If it's, something that's got nothing to do with the right review criteria, if it's some internal issue you're dealing with, you don't always have to volunteer every little problem that you have. But if you are, that board diversity is a great example, Lauren. If you are having a challenge with that, it is always better to be, I think, to be transparent about it, to be upfront about it, but to make sure that you have a plan for it. Okay. So I think it's a Simpsons quote where they say, we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas. You can't be like that, right? You can't just say, well, this is a problem, we haven't been able to do it, moving on. It is always better to say, we've had these sorts of issues. Here's what we're doing to address it. Here is the outreach we're working on. Here is how we're developing the board. Here is some training that we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. So I said earlier that when you are going through the process of writing a grant, developing a proposal, it's not just about the money, and that it's also about finding some of these issues that you really need to address internally, right? If there's something that you're not really happy to have to tell a funder, there's a deeper reason why. So to try to sum that up, confront it directly as much as is necessary, but always do so positively. Here's what we're doing to address it. Because if you just throw your hands up and say, we can't solve this problem, that is not going to instill that kind of confidence in your funder.
And panelists are going to notice things regardless of whether or not you point them out. So I don't think it's like, let's just sweep that under the rug and no one will notice it. Like you said, the panelists are pretty savvy, and they do notice things. So that's great advice, Bob. Do we have any other questions? I have maybe one other question for you, Bob, and maybe Leslie, if you have anything too. Well, this might be something that, if you're 10 days out, 2 weeks out from your application submission date, it might not be a good time to rework this, but project scope. I feel like one of the challenges sometimes we see in our project grant applications, and I know that a lot of the folks that are on this call noted that they were submitting project grant applications, is defining your scope for the grant. And this is something that probably should come before you are working on your grant application, but are there any tips that you would have for making sure you have a well-defined project grant or project scope to present to reviewers, specific language, that sort of thing? You touched on a lot of those tips, but anything you could elaborate on there?
Absolutely. Yes, and it's another great question and another tricky thing. This is part of the art, in some cases, of grant writing, right, as opposed to the science. First thought is that I would refer back to what we talked about with your budgets, which is to say, the budget is going to help you define a scope. And if you are doing that full cost budget and you're being really truthful and diligent about the actual cost of the program, then that scope is going to become clear to you, right? So if you're saying if you find yourself saying in a grant proposal, well, we're going to reach 10,000 people and we just need $2,500 to do it, unless this is a very light sort of touch project, that is going to be questioned, and that scope feels out of whack with your project budget. You might be saying that because you think, well, that extra $2,500 will finish off this much larger project budget and allow us to reach that number of people. That much larger project budget is what's going to be appropriate. That's what you're going to want to include in your grant proposal. So again, going back to really thinking through what's realistic. The other thing I would say, Lauren, is that it is so easy to hide behind fuzzy language when you're talking about scope, when you're talking about goals and outcomes. It's so easy to say we're going to help people enjoy the arts. That doesn't really tell me anything, right? Who here doesn't want to help people enjoy the arts? That's why we're all here. So I talked about not just checking the boxes, but doing what you can to maximize those points. What does that mean for your organization? How many people? When are we talking about this happening? And always too, I always push people to think about your outcomes. Outcomes are a change in your target community, okay? Your outputs are things like we did 10 workshops, or the things that the organization does and creates. We're doing this many performances. Attendance is kind of somewhere in the middle. Outcomes tell me what happens in your audience as a result of what you did, right? So this is another way of thinking about scope, because when that kid leaves the art museum, we don't necessarily want that to be the end of their engagement, right? That's not the scope of this program. The scope is that they get excited about it and they come back. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a pass in their hands that lets them bring their whole family back to the museum. We're going to track those passes and see how many of them come back. All of a sudden, the scope gets bigger. We start talking about not just kids liked art, but we start talking about here's what we want to happen as a result of that within that community that we are serving. So just a couple of thoughts there about scope.
That is so awesome. I want to just send this recording individually to everyone who is applying, and it's helpful to hear as staff here as well, just on what advice to give to folks who are working on their applications. We have a few minutes left in case anyone has any other questions. Because you mentioned the budget, I will just plug that we link to a fillable budget form in our organization grant applications. And it's always so nice when applicants use that fillable form because it adds everything up automatically. They don't have to do that. And so then they know there's no errors. So I know sometimes if people aren't used to PDF applications, they might print it out, hand fill it in, rescan it, and then it's harder for panelists to read and there might be errors. So I just recommend, if you can, use that fillable form and it will hopefully make your life easier. But I love that idea of starting with your budget to think about project scope. That's such good advice.
I have a question. And Bob, I know I've asked you this before, but I literally got this question like a day, like last week. For people who do the same project year after year and reapply, how to keep it fresh and not just fall into like a copy paste type thing. So I had someone who has had very great success. Like, how do I approach that,
Yeah, that's such a great question. So a couple of thoughts there. So first, I would say, if you are excited about this project on an ongoing basis, just make sure that's coming through, right? Why is this important? You're probably not reaching the same audience every year. So what's changing? What's different? What's fresh? I said earlier, I don't believe in just reinventing the wheel, just to do it. Everything must be reviewed. Not everything must be rewritten. Some of this may come from me now being a consultant, and so that's time, right? We want to be judicious about, I'm not just going to rewrite something for the heck of it and charge somebody to do that. That's not a good use of your time. So, but I would, you're always going to review, you're always going to reread. I would remind people again that your reviewers are going to change every year. So it would be easy to get into a rut if you knew you were talking to the same people over and over. Now, I've also seen that work to organizations' benefit. I've been on a panel with someone who's just like, oh, I just love this program. And, at that point, I don't think she was even reading the proposal. She just knew she loved the program. She'd known about it for years and years. Your panels are going to be changing. These are always going to be fresh people with fresh eyes. So make sure when you're reading your proposal, you have that in mind. What if someone knows nothing about this? Why is it exciting? Why is it still innovative? There's a certain threshold. I don't know when it is, but there's a certain threshold where you can start going, we've been doing this program for 15 years, and that's amazing, right? We have been consistent. We have been working with this community. We have been doing this great work and having these great results for a long time. And that's impressive too. Leaning on some of that historicity, I guess, can give you the excitement to match some of these other programs that are new and shiny, right? That's great too, but look at the investment that we have made. So thinking about it in those terms, maybe thinking about any changes in the target community that you have been serving, anything that shifted over the years. Here's something we learned. We used to do it this way. We have adapted. All that stuff can help keep it fresh, and keep the excitement about the program kind of coming through.
Great question, and
That's
thank
really
you,
great.
Bob, for speaking on that. That's super helpful to hear. Well, I want to be respectful of our presenters' time and for everyone's lunch hour. Thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us today. Best of luck to everyone on your grant applications. And as always, MAC staff is here for support and to answer questions. Of course, if it is the last day, our phones are ringing off the hook and we might not be able to get to your questions. So earlier is always better, as Bob said. So thanks again, Bob. I really appreciate you coming to speak with us today.
Happy to do it. Thanks everyone for your attention and your questions, and best of luck to all of you.